Today, we're diving deep into a moment of pure crisis from the book of Jeremiah. We're going to look at this high-stakes showdown between a prophet who's delivering a really tough message and a king who has to make a choice that will literally seal the fate of his entire nation.
And bam, here it is, straight from verse 12. There's no warm-up, no how do you do, just a shocking ultimatum dropped right in the lap of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. The command is just so blunt. Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and live. I mean, this goes against every single instinct for freedom, for sovereignty. It sets up an impossible conflict right from the start.
So, let's really unpack this. You have to understand, this isn't just Jeremiah giving some political advice. He's framing this as a command from God himself, a genuine life or death choice for everyone. And to get the full weight of this moment, we've got to look at who Zedekiah was and the incredibly shaky world he was trying to hold together.
Okay, this timeline is absolutely key. See, Zedekiah isn't some powerful, independent ruler. He was put on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon back in 597 BC. That makes him a vassal king, which basically means he's walking on eggshells, constantly dealing with pressure from his own court to rebel and team up with Egypt. So Jeremiah's prophecy lands right in the middle of this incredibly fragile, super dangerous political powder keg.
Now, to deliver this message, Jeremiah uses this powerful symbol of a yoke. You know, that wooden thing you put on oxen? To anyone back then, it meant one thing: being a servant, being conquered. But Jeremiah completely reframes it. He's arguing that putting on this yoke isn't some act of political cowardice. No, in this very specific moment, it's an act of submission to God's will. It's the hard but necessary way to accept God's judgment and make sure the nation itself actually survives.
Then, in verse 13, Jeremiah just makes the alternative brutally clear with this haunting question. This triple judgment, sword, famine, and pestilence, that wasn't just some generic scary talk. It was a terrifyingly accurate description of what happens during a long, drawn-out siege. And here's the kicker. Jeremiah is telling them all this suffering is completely avoidable. In his eyes, rebellion isn't brave. It's choosing, deliberately, to walk right into this catastrophe. But here's the thing. Jeremiah isn't preaching in a vacuum. Not at all. He is in a direct battle for the king's ear, and he's competing against a much more popular, much more comforting message.
This was the message Zedekiah was hearing all day long from his own court prophets, and you see it right there in verse 14. Of course, it appealed to national pride, to their faith, everything that people wanted to believe. It was a message of defiance, promising that God would step in and save them. It was hopeful, it was patriotic, and, as Jeremiah insists, it was dead wrong.
So here it is, the two paths laid bare right in front of the king. On one side, you have Jeremiah's costly truth, humility, submission, and survival. And on the other, the court's comforting lies, rebellion, this promise of miraculous deliverance. The king and the people are stuck right in the middle, having to figure out which voice is actually speaking for God. And in verse 15, we get God's verdict on these other prophets. The issue wasn't even about whether they were sincere or not. It was about their authority. God says it plainly, I have not sent them. They are claiming a divine seal of approval they just don't have, and that's what turns their comforting message into a dangerously destructive lie.
The conflict then gets even more specific. The false prophets aren't just making these vague promises of victory. Oh no, they're pointing to something very real, very tangible, and very sacred as proof that they're right.
Right, so the false prophets are pointing to the temple. They're promising that the sacred vessels, the ones that were stolen by Babylon back in 597 BC, would be returned shortly. Now, these weren't just fancy gold cups. They symbolized God's actual presence and the nation's special covenant. So to promise they were coming back any day now was to basically declare that God's judgment was already over and done with.
So in verse 18, Jeremiah just throws down this incredible challenge. He basically says, okay, fine. If these guys are really prophets of God, they shouldn't just be predicting good news. They should be able to get on their knees and plead with God to prevent the rest of the temple's treasures from being taken. It's a brilliant test of authenticity. A true prophet doesn't just tell you what you want to hear. They intercede. They align with God's difficult plans.
And what was still at stake? It was immense. We're talking about the monumental stuff still left in the temple. The two great bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, this massive bronze basin they called the sea, all these intricate bronze stands. I mean, these were iconic, foundational pieces from the original Solomon's temple. Their very presence was fueling this false hope that God would never let his house be totally destroyed.
And this brings us to the final crucial part of Jeremiah's prophecy, This is where he reveals the full scope of God's plan. And it's a plan that includes both a devastating judgment and, eventually, a path back home.
Jeremiah just lays out the inevitable truth in verse 22. Not only are the vessels already in Babylon not coming back soon, but every single one of these remaining treasures, they're going to be carried away too. This is the complete and total reversal of what the false prophets were saying. The judgment isn't over, it's about to be finished.
But the prophecy doesn't end in disaster. And this is where it gets amazing. Look how this timeline shows its incredible long-term accuracy. In 586 BC, just like Jeremiah warned, the rest of the stuff is taken to Babylon. Decades later, in 539, Babylon itself falls to Persia. And just 1 year after that, King Cyrus issues his famous decree, letting the Jewish people go home and rebuild.
This is the crucial promise, tucked away at the very end of verse 22. God's judgment has an end point. He says the exile will last until the day that I visit them. This shows that the discipline, as incredibly severe as it was never meant to be permanent. Restoration was always part of the long-term plan.
And that brings us to the key takeaway from this whole incredible passage: submission before restoration. For Zedekiah and the people of Judah, the only path to a future, to restoration, was through accepting the difficult, humbling reality of their present. Resisting God's plan, no matter how patriotic it felt, was only going to lead to complete annihilation.
And this leaves us with a timeless and pretty challenging question. Zedekiah had to choose between a prophet telling him a hard truth he did not want to hear and a whole chorus of voices telling him exactly what he wanted to believe. And it really forces us to ask ourselves, in our own lives, in our own crises, how do we get better at distinguishing between a costly truth and a comforting lie?